Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. In case you were absent or you missed something from the day in class, I just wanted to do this quick video on the introduction to the factor market, also called the resource market. That way, if you have any questions about this, you could ask. Just remember that we did look earlier in the year at the circular flow model. And just remember, both households and businesses participate in two types of markets, right? We know in the product market that households are on the consumption side. Households are buying goods and services, and they're giving money to businesses, which take that in as revenue. And businesses, of course, are on the supply side in the product market. And everything up until this point, we've been working on the product market. Everything has generally been a good that's being produced, a hat, a pair of glasses, a coffee cup, whatever it is, in firms that are using inputs or using resources to create outputs, okay? And the output market is the product market. Of course, there's also a market that is known as the resource market or the factor market. Resources like labor and land and capital are all for sale in the factor market. And in this case, businesses are on the demand side. They are going to pay for these factors, and it is a cost. Labor is a cost. Capital is a cost to businesses, and they have an interest in keeping those costs low. And for households are on the receiving end. Households are going to be offering labor for income. They're going to be offering land that they own for rent. And households are also going to speculate in markets and contribute funds that goes to capital. So there is a great deal of ways in which households are providing the labor, land, and capital, and businesses are going to see those purchases as costs, okay? Households significantly receive wages, rent, interest, or profits, and those become sources of income. When we look at, kind of how much across the entire United States income is earned, we can get a sense that about maybe 70% of all U.S. households make their income 70% of the income is coming from labor sources, right? And of course, there's some income that's coming from those other factors. But the factor market is really important, not only to firms, because firms have an interest in buying factors that they're going to then turn into products in the product market, right? So these two markets are totally related, and businesses are participating in both. They're buying factors in the factor market, they're producing products in the product market, and doing both of those things simultaneously. So of course, our households, but the factor market is very important for households also because they are receiving their income. The way in which one family or a group of people are receiving income is related to the factor market. Okay, so we have a really significant, aspect because we've been addressing or reading about during the pandemic issues of income inequality, and issues of ways, we can look at greater equity when it comes to wealth and income. Income is what we're looking at in the factor market going to households, okay? And it is something, measurable. In reminding you, when we're talking about resources or factors of production, those things can be used interchangeably, whether it's factors, resources, inputs, okay? We're looking at land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Recall that land means all natural resources, okay? So the ocean, the fish, the corn, the land that's for sale is real estate. All of that is land that is land, okay? Labor is any type of working resource, a human being that's working. Capital generally means machines. Don't get that mixed up with the word capital in finance, which sometimes means like a liquid capital or money. In this case, we always mean some type of good that is producing consumer goods, okay? So capital is what we make consumer goods with. Factory, pizza ovens, the chairs in my classroom, the tables in my classroom, your laptop, all of that would be capital goods, okay? If you're using it for producing consumer goods. And entrepreneurship, kind of coordinating and putting together all those other resources. Resource prices are really important. Of course, they're part of ATC, so we know that we care about resource prices, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. It does have a lot to do with income determination. So that's one reason why it's important. Firms are interested in it because it does, resource prices are part of the recipe for minimizing costs. Firms are going to maximize profits when revenues are big and costs are not big. So we're always looking at profits being the difference between revenue and costs. So if costs are lower, that's important, and something we're seeing currently right now is a lot of resource prices are increasing due to high rates of inflation, and so we're seeing lots and lots of issues with resource prices and how that can affect a market. Resource allocation. So just like any market, the purpose of the market is to create an allocatively efficient quantity. How much of the resource does society want? So whether the resource is oil, the resource is something that is a particular nurses as a labor source. If we need more or less of that particular resource, then we ultimately should see shifts in our market, right? So allocating the right quantity of resources is also something we get from this market. And of course, there's a lot of policy issues that attach to this topic. For example, minimum wage, okay? Just like in the product market where we had different market types. So we had in the product market firms that were either monopoly or perfect competition, oligopoly or monopolistic competition. In the resource market, we have only two types, and both of these are extreme versions, okay? So we have perfect competitor, where there's a great deal of firms, many firms competing for the same factors, hospitals or doctors' offices, schools competing for the factor of nurses, right? The labor resource of nurses. Or the other alternative will be a monopsony. It's not a monopoly, but a monopsony. A monopsony is a single firm that is hiring labor, for example. The only firm that's buying that particular resource, okay? First, we'll look at perfectly competitive labor markets. It is the more significant of the two, although I would spend some time with the monopsony model. A perfectly competitive labor market has some things in common with the perfectly competitive product market, but it is a little bit different, so it's important to kind of pay attention to that. First of all, the characteristics. Many firms, and these firms don't have to be exactly alike. So it's doctors' offices, it's hospitals, it's schools, it's maybe, visiting nurse services. A whole bunch of different types of firms are all hiring nurses, and they're all in that same market, which is buying nurses, okay? So there's a certain supply of nurses, and there's going to be demand for nurses in this market. No one firm is large enough to manipulate the market. So the wage that we find for nurses in the market is not going to be set by one firm. Okay, there's going to be so many firms competing that the equilibrium wage that gets set will be set in the market, not in the firm. Many workers will have identical skills. So something we are going to imagine is homogeneous in this model is going to be nurses, right? We're not going to assume that, these 10 nurses are extraordinary and these 10 nurses stink. It has to do with all of these folks being, equipped and licensed, nurses to do job X, Y, and Z. Wage is going to be constant for the firm. Okay, so for the firm, not for the market. The equilibrium wage will be found in the market, which will have an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. Wage is constant for the firm. Firms are going to be wage takers. So, same idea, no one firm is large enough to manipulate the market. So firms are wage takers. And we're going to see that firms can hire as many workers as they want at a wage set by the industry or market. Okay, we're going to see a perfectly elastic wage or a perfectly elastic marginal resource cost. Okay, that doesn't mean that that the firms will hire any amount of workers, because there will be a profit maximizing quantity of workers, and that's really the key question that we're asking in this initial kind of exercise: is how many workers or how many robots or how many acres of land should a firm purchase? What would each next resource basically cost the firm versus how much revenue will that next resource, that next marginal resource, bring into the firm, okay? So resource demand, an important concept is this concept of derived demand, okay? Resource demand means that the demand itself is dependent on the demand in the product market. If we have a significant increase in the demand for pizza, okay? So imagine everybody in the country wants pizza. You can't get enough pizza. Demand curve for pizza is through the roof. The price of pizza is increasing. What is going to happen for the demand for all of the resources that make pizza? You know, pizza makers, cheese and cows and milking machines and all of these other related industries. Clearly, they are going to also see an increase in demand. So if you are a resource that's producing a product that relates to your resource, and you're producing a product, and that product is in greater and greater and greater demand, you know, you're going to be in greater and greater and greater demand. If you're producing a product that nobody wants, you know, nobody wants a worker who's going to make that product or a machine that's going to make that product. Okay, an increase in the demand for cars increases the demand for, you know, mechanics, maybe individuals who are assembling the car, maybe people who are making like the glass manufacturer, you know, that makes the, you know, whichever. There might be certain of these products could certainly be looked at as, you know, consumer goods, but certainly if you were putting a whole car together, we would imagine all those various different car parts could be seen as resources, as capital or whichever. And so an increase in the demand for cars is going to increase the demand for all of those different resources that are needed: workers, capital, and you know, maybe even factory space and land. This is the concept of derived demand. Okay, the demand for resources is determined or derived by the products that they help produce. Okay, that is a very important concept. If you remember that, there will be questions on the quiz and on the AP exam about derived demand, okay? Derived demand is going to depend on, and we already know the price of the good it helps to produce is part of this, right? That's really what derived demand is, okay? We also know that the demand curve for the firm in a perfectly competitive factor market is also going to depend on the productivity of a resource, okay? Productivity of a resource matters a great deal. You know, think of yourself being able to produce, you know, even your economics homework, how much you can do with a pencil, with a laptop, you know, with resources that you might utilize, you can be incredibly productive, right? The more education you get, you're incredibly productive. And later on, we'll start to see that, you know, the demand for resources is even what sets, or one of the things that sets the wages, right, in a market. So when you have a lot of productive capacity, that's one thing that can increase the demand curve for a resource, okay, because it ultimately lends itself to, you know, having greater and greater and greater ability to produce, you know, that marginal product of labor. We'll get to this a little bit more, but kind of keep in mind that if we were to take this recipe of marginal product of labor, every single next resource, whether it's a robot or it's a worker, we're calling it marginal product of labor, but it could be the marginal product of the machine or whatever. Every next resource that's hired is going to produce a certain quantity of the product, right? The more productive that resource is, the more they produce, okay? That marginal product times the price of the product is basically the value of that resource unit. When we use this term, the marginal revenue product, we're essentially looking at how much additional marginal revenue does the next resource bring in for the firm. So I hire the next nurse. How much revenue do I get from that nurse? Or I hire the next worker or the next machine that's producing hats. How much additional revenue do I get from hiring that next one? Okay, and remember that if you have a perfectly competitive product market, the price is going to be constant, but the marginal product is not constant. The more you hire the next worker, the next worker, the next worker, the next worker, because of the law of diminishing marginal returns, the marginal product will decrease, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. And this is where we see some of this relationship, okay? Now I'm going to draw a little bit so we can kind of see what this looks like. We do have the wage that's set in the market, and there's an equilibrium wage. And this looks a little different than the product market already because this is the market or the industry. And we see, first of all, the demand curve. This is really going to represent the firms. I'm just going to kind of put like a little factory here. I can't draw. I'm doing it with my mouse. And this is the supply of workers. So the supply curve is upward sloping. This is basically saying, okay, for every wage increase, there's going to be more and more and more individuals who are interested in working for that wage. So